Well, the first thing that I consider is what do I think the population is doing? If you're creating a simplified strategy and your opponents have huge leaks, then it's a lot easier because if your opponent is, for example, overfolding by 10% to a bet, you can often just bet your entire range because that's what Pile Solver would do if you put it in that situation. Most of the coaching that I do now is for high stakes players. So unless we're playing a recreational player, we usually don't have exploits that are that large. And even if we did, we wouldn't want to be so obvious about our strategy because our opponents at those levels are more capable of adjusting if they see us doing something as obvious as betting range. So um, a lot of the simplified strategies that I work on now are actually simplifying GTO strategies rather than being very exploitative and just sort of like brute force. Now I focus more on sort of emulating a solver, but doing so in a way that people can actually reliably do it in game while they're multi-tabling online. So the first step of that is to usually to simplify to a single sizing. And if we can't simplify to a single sizing, we are at least using one sizing per texture. So we're never splitting our range across multiple sizes. I think that's pretty much impossible to do accurately. Um, Not just on the street that you're talking about, but also on future streets. It gets incredibly complicated once you start splitting your range. And the next step is to try to nail your frequencies with that single bet size, which with each hand category, trying to figure out how much each hand class is betting and put that into a protocol that people can remember relatively easily and follow along with. So that's sort of the general idea of what I'm doing right now. Well, the most interesting, I mean, I would have to say a lot of these smaller geofence sites are the most interesting. You have some sites in the US, some sites in Canada, um, even India has opened up recently. And it, you asked me what is interesting. So it's maybe not interesting in some ways, but I like really demolishing soft pools. That's fun for me. So um, some of these sites are really it's like going back in time 10 or 15 years because people are playing really badly on them. And it's fun to see how much you can uh, increase a student's win rate. Just to kind of see what the ceiling is. Could you win it 10 big blinds per 100? Could you win at 15? Maybe you could win in 20. I think 20 is possible on some of these sites. So that's interesting. And GG is offering the highest stakes. ACR also offers some pretty high stakes. That's going to be more interesting if you like the challenge of playing against really tough players. I don't really recommend this to everybody. You really need to have that desire to compete at a really high level if you want to play on these sites at nosebleeds. And it's just not for everyone. I think it is probably the most money you could make as far as the ceiling. But there's also going to be a lot more variance. And if you're just thinking about the money, you're not going to last in that competition. I think you really need to just have a love for the game and want to test yourself more than anything to play on those sites at the highest stakes. And then you have sort of like the middle ground, which is just playing 1K, 500, maybe some 2K on sites like Bovada, or even ACR has just a ton of 1K action.
And you can make a really good living doing that. And I don't think there's any shame in doing that. I think a lot of sites, around 1K is probably the best bang for your buck as far as not having too much stress, not dealing with too much variance, but still like making potentially a really solid six-figure income. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can go about being an online cash game player right now. And there's a lot of different interesting ways to do it. Yeah, I think every 2 or 3 years, you kind of want to update your database that you're looking at because things do change. In the last few years, I think the biggest change is that people are defending the river better. When I started working with Poker Detox in 2019, one of the things that I found was that the population was not responding well to overbets. They were overfolding a lot to overbets, and we made a lot of money for a while just by bludgeoning people with huge overbet bluffs, and they would just fold and fold, and we made a lot of money that way. Now it's this is February 2023 when this is being recorded. Uh, you definitely see pools responding better to overbets. They're just more common, and people do understand that they have to call them sometimes. Um, and in general, people are defending rivers a little bit better, but it's not like a night and day difference. It's not like you have to completely change your strategy every few years, but it is good to keep up with the trends. Yeah, the work that I've done on my course over the past couple of years has not really been about changing the exploits too much. Although I definitely have dialed back the bluffing a lot because of just the changes that we've seen. But other than that, it's my focus in the last couple of years really has more been about simplifying GTO so that my students can fall back onto a really balanced strategy if they want to, and also sort of disguise their exploits better. So that's really been the focus, kind of going deeper with my strategy over the last couple of years and deeper into theory, especially, and leaving those exploits behind a little bit rather than just changing them. Yeah, I have an article on my blog about this if anyone's interested in reading it. I think it's called High Performers versus Low Performers. And one of the biggest differences that I see between high performers and low performers is that for whatever reason, low performers are unwilling or unable to focus on the things that really matter. They will, for example, if you tell them to um, C bet range for 1/3 when they're in position in a single raise pot, they will maybe, for example, be really concerned that they're supposed to be using an overbet on an ace king three type of board and not a 1/3 c bet size, or using a large bet on a low disconnected board. And if they're using a 1/3 c bet on these boards, then they're not playing correctly in theory. They're not too concerned about how big of a mistake is that actually in the grand scheme of things, because in reality, they're maybe giving up a few tenths of a percent of the pot in EV by not using the correct bet size. And what's actually important is getting to the turn and then getting to the river in a simpler way, um, without totally blowing up the complexity of your strategy. So I find that low performers are just constantly almost obsessed with minutia and just things that don't matter very much. Logistics are
hugely important as well. I think that the most successful students I have are often very organized. They play on a schedule and they don't uh, allow themselves to go too far off of that schedule. Their routine is quite dialed in. And so another thing that I notice about high performers is logistically, they're a lot stronger. So they have a much stronger schedule. If you're not familiar with the term logistical, it just means having to do with planning and organization. So they're a lot more organized about their routines. They take it much more seriously as a job. Whereas people who struggle in poker, especially people who struggle to get out of low stakes, they tend to treat poker more like a video game hobby than a job. They might not really have a schedule that they play on. They might not have a real volume goal that they stick to. They might not have a real study schedule that they stick to. They just study when they feel like it. They're not too serious about coaching or um, studying alongside other strong poker players. And so they might do things like play while they're distracted. Maybe they're surfing the internet while they're playing, and they don't really think that's an issue, but it actually is a huge issue. So logistics are really very important. And then, there are other things too. Again, you can check out that article, but uh, uh, yeah, I think that those are two of the biggest patterns I've noticed. And of course, there are just many kind of invisible X factors, which I don't really know how to predict who is going to be a successful poker player and who isn't, because there's just so many things that go into it. I don't use any sort of artificial intelligence in my studies or software. Uh, I have seen some of it. There's a solver called Ruse, which is looks really interesting, which I've seen. It's incredibly fast and can just solve in real time incredibly quickly. I think it's going to be very interesting. I don't know if, honestly, if I'm going to be able to adapt, if that's the direction that the industry goes. I'm either going to need to bring people onto my team who are very good with that, or um, if not, then I'm probably going to have difficulty adapting because I just have no background in that at all. But possibly what will happen is that a lot of solvers start to go this direction, and it just ends up being very user friendly, and it's just kind of good for everyone who wants to study poker. But I don't think that I really understand it well enough to make any big predictions about what's going to happen. I think if it's just someone who's just starting out and who wants to make poker their profession, what I would usually recommend is give it about 6 months, maybe a year at most on your own and see how far you get. If you're not moving up in stakes pretty rapidly after your first year, then I would suggest trying to get some sort of coaching. And you could even skip this step, the first step of trying it on your own at the beginning. The only reason I say that is because if you are someone who is really talented, you're going to make a lot more money if you stay on your own rather than if you give up a portion of your profits to a coach. If you're really talented, you might not need to do that, and you could make more money and get established a lot faster. But most people are not going to be able to do that on their own, especially these days. Games are a lot tougher. And for most people, I would suggest shopping around, looking at different CFPs and coaches. There's a lot of them these days, and there's no one way to study poker. Each one has a different style, and I think the best thing to do is to just look at all of these coaches and CFPs and find the one that resonates the most with you, and then get coaching, because it's just really hard to make it on your own these days. And it is a really effective shortcut often to just find a coach who can really help you. Some things you want to look for, definitely, if you're thinking about joining a CFP, are transparency with results. If a CFP is not sharing the results of a lot of their students, ideally all of their students, but if they're not showing at least a dozen people who've gone through their program and gotten good results, I think that's a pretty big red flag. The coaches also should have results. They don't necessarily need to be actively playing full time anymore. I think actually that's unrealistic to expect a poker coach to also be playing full time, because coaching is in itself a full time job. So that would be like having two full time jobs. But it is important for a poker coach to have at least shown that they can beat high stakes at some point in the recent past, like in the last 5 years or so. And then finally, if you do think about joining a CFP, I would recommend reaching out to the other players and anyone that you can get in touch with at that CFP, and just ask them what their experience has been. Because if they're unhappy, they'll tell you. And so you do want to be careful with some of these contracts, because it's usually like a 2 or 3 year commitment, and you don't want to make that decision lightly. But I do think that there are a lot of CFPs out there with very good results. And if you get into one and you put in the work and the coaching methodology resonates with you, I think that it really can be very worth it. There's not a huge difference between different stakes in online poker. The biggest difference actually is just the number of fish at each table. As you increase stakes, you have less and less fish. So that's the main thing that makes it more difficult to beat. Although also when you increase stakes, the rate goes down. So that makes it in the opposite direction a little bit easier to beat, actually. But in terms of the way that the regs play, there's not a huge difference. I think you can definitely feel, if you move up in stakes, you can kind of feel that people get a little bit more aggressive at each limit as you move up. For example, at 200 NL, people might not be able to find really unnatural bluffs, like turning pairs into bluffs. They might not be able to recognize certain situations where it's very difficult to find bluffs and they have to really reach into their range to get them. Whereas at higher stakes, people will be able to bluff enough in those spots. But overall, there's not a huge difference. I've never even studied stakes lower than 100 NL. I don't think it's really even worth it, because micro stakes are pretty easy to beat anyway. So if you're modeling your strategy off of how people play there, it's best case scenario, it's not going to last very long. You're going to move up from those stakes, and then your strategy is going to be worthless. So I always just based my strategy on mid to high stakes, and people at micros have no problem using that, because if a strategy is going to beat mid to high stakes, then it's certainly going to beat micros with pretty minimal adjustments. So right now I study 200 NL plus, and then I do some work with 1K NL plus databases as well. But in terms of just overall frequencies, there's really not huge differences. You'd be surprised, I think. A lot of people would be surprised that 200 NL does not look that different from 2K NL. I typically just have my students use GTO ranges for pre-flop. There are some leaks still that occur pre-flop at the population level, some spots where people overfold, some spots where people overdefend. And uh, I think adjustments can be made in those spots sort of on the fly. But for the most part, I think it's best to stick to the GTO ranges pre-flop, at least in cash games, because at this point, people do play pretty close to balanced pre-flop, and you can't really pull off too many hard exploits pre-flop because pre-flop spots are so commonly occurring. So if you're doing something really weird and exploitative pre-flop, your opponents are going to see it happen a lot. And the more quickly they can recognize that you're exploiting, the more quickly they can adjust to that exploit. So I think in general, when you're exploiting your opponent, the later in the hand you can do it, the safer it is, because they just don't see it as often, and they don't see the showdown as often. I do my public program is Mobius Cash, and that's a high stakes cash game group. So that's my only public coaching is for cash games, but I do privately coach a group of MTT players as well, and have done a good amount of work on MTTs. I think that the opportunities for exploiting players are larger in MTTs. I see that MTT players are a bit behind cash game players in terms of playing balanced post flop. And then also, I think in MTTs, you have more opportunities to exploit pre flop, because whereas in cash games, you have a pretty static pre flop structure. In MTTs, things are always changing. So if people don't understand certain concepts in ICM, there's a lot of opportunities to exploit there. So if anything, MTTs are actually more interesting in cash. I just mainly focus on cash because that's my specialty. The first place I start with most of my students is river aggression. So often players are just not bluffing enough on the river, and I have to fix that because usually they're incentivized to do the opposite. They're incentivized to bluff more than equilibrium. Overfolding river is also an extremely common leak. Like I said in the beginning, it's not as big of an issue now as it was years ago, but people still on average do overfold. It's just by less. So getting the river aggression up, the river fold down is usually the first place that I start. And then apart from that, I mean, there's just leaks everywhere still. You'd be surprised. I work with only players at 500 and out plus these days, but it's rare that I get a new student and I do their first database review and I don't find some sort of significant pre-flop leak. Like maybe they're not three betting enough, or maybe they are overfolding their blind. And you would think that, this person is a successful poker player. They're already making a living playing poker full time, and they should have something as basic as pre-flop totally figured out. But that's just not the case. And the reason is just because they never checked. And the reason is because they never checked. They just never did a comprehensive database review before and checked every pre-flop spot to make sure that they were actually folding or raising at the right frequencies. People overfold on the flop and turn everywhere as well. just, one common example is blind versus blind in single raise pots. When a player is on the big blind, it's extremely hard to defend optimally versus a 1/3 C bet in position. So just to clarify, the small blind opens, you call on the big blind, the flop is dealt, and the small blind bets like 30% pot. You can run this spot. I recommend running it on a GTO trainer or something, and just try to count the amount of times you get dealt a combo, which is a pure fold in that spot. And you'll find that those situations are really rare, that you actually have a pure fold combo. Most of the time, you're going to have a pure call, and then some of the time, you're going to have a hand which is indifferent and needs to call some frequency. But you rarely get a pure fold because you're only allowed to fold about a quarter of the time in this spot. And people reliably fold, between 5 and 10% too much in that spot. So there's spots like that all over. It's just really hard to play as aggressively and loosely as the solver plays.